So at the end of the season, everything's playing out, and we know that Manchester City have won the Premier League, but we still don't know who quite is going to be relegated. But if you look back at the video that I produced at the beginning of the season, I was saying to you that wage bill more or less correlates to the final league positions that you have within clubs. So if we look, there was a great graphic that Sky Sports brought up recently. If we look at the net spend that teams have made since 2014, I'll bring up the graphic on the screen somewhere here. If you look at that net spend that that teams have made since 2014, you'll notice who's at the top of the list, but Manchester City. They've spent nearly £500 million on new players, and as a consequence they've run away with the league this year. Number 2 of the net spenders is Manchester United, and they have ended up in second place. So while Jose Mourinho is no doubt a good manager, they have spent their way to league position number 2. However, if you look at the net spend and you go down towards the bottom, you'll see that we also have Spurs and Liverpool there. So they actually haven't spent much more than they've earned in player sales, and yet they've done pretty well. So you've got to give credit to Pochettino and Klopp for producing 2 really good teams who have been very competitive despite not actually spending an awful lot of money on brand new players. So the net spend is interesting because it tells you that balance between what you've spent on players coming in and what you've sold. But ultimately it is wage bill that determines that. So if you ranked it by wage bill, Liverpool, Spurs will be much, much higher up. But nonetheless, you can still see that they've done a good job when you look at the net spend, the balance between transfers in and out. But more or less, this just reinforces the video that I did at the beginning of the year, which basically said if you spend a lot of money, you're going to finish higher in the league. So if you want to do that, that's the way to go. But you'll notice at the bottom of that list is Southampton, and they have sold far more players than they have bought. So, you know, shock horror, they've had a dreadful season. What a surprise. It seemed to be a surprise to the board, but to absolutely nobody else across the entire league. So yeah, it's not a surprise to me that they have struggled this year. And also I think there's a bit of confirmation bias in there. They had a good year, finished high in the league, sold loads of players and cashed in on that success, and then they had another good season. So they thought, well, okay, you know, all of a sudden, you know, we have a model that works beautifully well. And the fact is, whether you're trading, in business, whatever you're doing, don't let yourself slip into that mode. You have to remain humble with whatever you do, and each year treat in isolation, because they seemed to think that they'd found some magical way of selling all of your best players and still finishing high up in the league. And the fact is, long term, that is not sustainable. There's a balance to be had there, and flogging off all your best players will lead to a lower league position. It's just inevitable. Most clubs tend to do that because of debt, but Southampton chose to do that just to cash in on players. So as a consequence, you know, they've suffered as a result, and they may still go down. If you look at the fixtures that they've got coming up, they're playing Everton this weekend, and if you look at Everton's home form, they've played really well at home, but not so well away. And Southampton haven't played particularly well away, and so you combine those two and you sort of think that maybe a result is not likely at Everton. However, when you look at the next match, which is Swansea, and you look at how they performed against teams within that part of the league, Southampton don't have a dreadful set of results against those teams, and Swansea don't have a great set of results against those teams away. They're a little bit more mixed there. And then of course the final match of the season for Southampton is against City. I was rather hoping that City would qualify for the Champions League final, and then they would have to rest their team for that last match of the season. But Southampton could find themselves having to win against Manchester City on the last day of the season. And if you look at that net spend table, they are at opposite ends of the table in terms of wage, in terms of net spend, in terms of everything. And Manchester City have just wiped the floor this year. So not sure if they're going to pull that off. I'll be at the match and give them a shout to see if they can, but really you don't want to drop down into the Championship, because the Championship is an ultra competitive league, very, very hard to get out of. Teams that come out of the Premier League get a parachute payment that they will spend trying to get back up again, and then you've got teams that want to get into the Premier League for that immense amount of cash that they get, that will overspend and spend beyond their means to try and get promoted. So it's a nightmare division to get out of. If you've got momentum coming from lower leagues and through and up, then that's great, because you can carry that momentum forward. But if you're trying to get back up after coming down and you don't have that momentum, you won't attract the players. If you're a selling club, the players will only come there if they think they've got an opportunity of playing at a higher level, and so on and so on. So yeah, it's going to be difficult, and really I would have preferred Southampton not to have sold some of these players, or to have had a stronger management team and a better manager for most of the season. In fact, you could tell from Southampton's results, if you look and you group results, they had all of their easy home games in the first half of the season. So when they didn't win as many of those as they should have done, you knew that they were going to be in trouble, because all of the harder home games came at the back end of the season, which is exactly when you don't want them. You want the easy games at the back end of the season. So if you look at the fixture list, very often you can identify teams that are likely to run into trouble. So it's something that's worth doing. And one of the things that I haven't discussed before, that I do throughout the year on the football leagues, is I'll look at the odds that people are being offered, because odds generally are pretty efficient, and then I'll see how teams perform against that, and that will allow me to construct a league of overperformers and underperformers. So if you look at teams that are playing at home, this reiterates what we had to say about the Everton and Southampton match. Everton have performed consistently well above what they should do at home. So there's something about Everton at home that means that they tend to perform particularly well. However, look at Southampton on that table and you will find that they're right at the bottom. They significantly underperformed at home. And I think that, they had all of those easy games, in inverted commas, at the beginning of the season. They failed miserably on those, and that was the major warning sign that there was going to be a problem. So the unfortunate thing is, if you look at the away performances over the course of the season, you'll see Southampton is second from bottom there as well. So other than being terrible at home, they're pretty terrible away. But the funny thing is, in relation to the chance that they should have had of winning the match, actually Arsenal have performed the worst over the course of the season away from home. But again, you can sort of pick up on these trends fairly early on in the season, and they tend to be persistent and they tend to continue, apart from if there's a change of managers at some point, because it tends to be a manager-led thing in terms of the style of play, the players that they play and the formations, and how they're likely to perform over a period of time. So yeah, as we approach the end of the season, you can see that things have pretty much played out the way that you would have expected at the beginning of the season, but also when you look at the imagery that I put up in terms of teams that performed above or below their current performance, the way that I've constructed these is to say the market thinks they have a 50% chance of winning this match at home, and in fact they didn't. So it's adding up all those implied probabilities, masking them off against the results, and as the season progresses you begin to get a picture of who is or isn't underperforming, and that can be pretty beneficial over the course of the year. But if you're looking for relegation candidates, you could use a couple of those different things either at the start of the season or as the season progressed to identify which teams are likely to underperform. And at this stage in time, I don't know if Southampton will avoid relegation or not. I'm sort of thinking that it's 50-50 at this moment in time. It all hinges on that Swansea match. If Southampton beats Swansea, or Swansea beats Southampton, then the team that wins is probably safe. If they both draw, anything could happen in that little pile of fixtures at the bottom of the league. So yeah, it's an interesting year, but ultimately quite predictable. A couple of little bit of outperformers, and like I said in the video, watch it if you haven't seen it before. I'll link to it in the end screen. Now you always tend to get a few performers in that middle grouping that tends to do well. And I think the unusual thing about this season so far is we don't have any of the promoted teams getting immediately relegated. Not yet anyway. There's still opportunity for that to happen. But yeah, football dominated by money, and that tends to translate into performances. But even when the season is underway, you'll begin to pick up on patterns, and that was fairly clear for me as a Southampton fan fairly early on in the season. And hopefully you can relate to some of that. I hope your team stays up or gets promoted, whichever division that you're in. And I'm looking forward now to the World Cup, because the World Cup is going to be huge this year. Loads of liquidity, plenty of opportunity, and probably a few missed penalties for England if everything runs to form. Anyhow, hope that was useful for you.